It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
No, not okay.
Hello, this is Paul, and today I want to talk about EC Comics. We did a program on comic books, the comic book controversy of the 1950s a while ago when the graphic novel Mouse was being removed from school libraries in Tennessee. And we did talk about the whole controversy about comic books and the tremendous impact that had on American politics. That Estes Kefauver, the senator from Tennessee, used his campaign against comic books as how they were it would lead to juvenile delinquency and all kinds of other problems, and used that to project himself into the vice presidential nomination for the Democratic Party in 1956, beating out a young aspiring senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's career could have been very different had he been on that ticket in 1956. Well, we already talked about that, but the main issue in the comic book controversy, the one that comes up more often than not, is the whole nature of EC Comics. What are EC Comics? What does EC even stand for? Originally, EC Comics was educational comics. It was started by a man, Milton Gaines, and it had even stories from the Bible. It got a classic story. But Milton Gaines was succeeded by his son, William Gaines, who changed the title from educational comics to entertaining comics and created a whole empire of comics that were very controversial, but also in many ways very important. We're taking on issues that were not being dealt with even in the media or the press of that period. Following World War II, most of the superhero comics came to an end. They just didn't have the same kind of a market. And what replaced them, as we've talked about before, were horror comics and crime comics. And if you go back and look at some of these examples of what was being done, these were grim, shocking by any standards, including today's. So when we talk about the comic book controversy, there really was a controversy. And it wasn't just EC. It was at the peak of about 1954, before the comic book code came in and shut down most of these comics. That was self-censorship to protect the industry, trying to protect itself from government interference with people like Estes Kefauver and his House Committee on Juvenile Delinquency looking into and raising these questions about comic books. And in a famous instance, Kefauver held up an EC comic with the grisly cover of a blonde woman's severed head with dripping blood and the rest of her torso lying on the floor. And Estes Kefauver famously held this up and said, "Would you call this decent? Would you call this acceptable literature for children?" And of course, the answer was, of course, no. And this was on the front page of the New York Times. It got a lot of other coverage. But the solution was, in many ways, as is often the case, worse than the problem, because what happened was there was a massive censorship movement that affected not only comic books, it affected children's literature in general. It affected show business people. It involved Lucy, who was the star of I Love Lucy in that period. All of this went on and was very kind of disconcerting. Well, first of all, to talk about EC Comics is to realize how many issues they had, how much of an empire this was. It was, first of all, horror comics were huge. I think by about 1954, before they were shut down because of all the controversy, but by about that time, there were like 70 different titles, these 10-cent comic books, and some of them, again, very, very grisly, very gruesome, and again, things that younger children should not be reading. A good friend of mine told me the story about how when he was about 8 years old, on a Christmas morning, he opened up his Christmas stocking, and his parents, with the best of intentions, had put in some comic books, but they hadn't really looked at what they had. And here he was with these horror comics that scared him half to death, And I remember reading some of these, and now I was too young to be buying them on the newsstand, but I had friends who had older brothers and so forth, and they would have them around, or they'd be in the barber shop or something like that. And these were scary. These were disturbing. Let me just mention what was involved in this. There were 3 horror titles: Tales from the Crypt, The Haunt of Fear, and The Vault of Horror. And the artists involved were people who went on to have major careers elsewhere. Will Elder, Jack Davis, Wally Wood. I mean, they did covers for Time and a whole host of other mainstream magazines. Also, there were a number of science fiction titles, weird fantasy, and science, weird science fiction, so forth. And they would include stories by people we now regard as major writers like Ray Bradbury, but that was not picked up in this period. And what makes the EC comics important is that they focused on social issues long before the mainstream media did in many cases. They went right after the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they made a mockery of how that commission was raised. A lot of, actually, the most famous title, I mentioned there's the horror, the science fiction. There's also crime suspense stories, and several of those which were also part of the ones that Estes Kiefelhofer picked up, because in some ways they were even more bloody because they weren't dealing with monsters. They were dealing with supposedly average people or real life people. But the most famous EC comic was Mad. And that lasted for 23 issues, after which they avoided the censorship by going to a magazine format. And Mad Magazine was published for decades. And again, a major source of satire and mockery of a lot of things. Much of what was done in the Mad was focusing on popular television shows or comics of that era. So instead of Archie, very famous comic book series, and Riverdale High Teenager, very popular series, well, they did a story called Starchy, where the so-called Archie character, the Starchy character, is a juvenile delinquent, which is what the criticism was about these comics. Nobody ever proved that they spurred on or encouraged juvenile delinquency, but that was what was presented. Also, we have to mention the notorious book by Frederick Wertham labeled The Seduction of the Innocent, where he made these outrageous claims about how children's minds were being poisoned and distorted by reading all these terrible. He didn't stop with just horror comics. He went after everything. He went after Superman, Batman, basically that comic books would corrupt the minds of the youth. It got to be that severe and that bad. Well, go back to EC. These were not really for children. And again, the answer to the question about who's reading them and how are people being corrupted, the answer would be similar to what we have as the movie rating system. Have a G, PG, PG-13, R, so forth. Comics could have been designated in those terms. But EC, they were very creative in much of what they did. And they did deal with social issues. As I say, they went after the McCarthy era witch hunts that were going on, and the comic books were a spin-off of that. McCarthy was finally censored by the Senate in 1954, and he just faded in alcoholism and died a few years later, having ruined any number of people's careers and lives by claiming they were communist sympathizers or communist spies, with no evidence whatsoever to support this. So this is an example of where propaganda had taken over news, and that was much the case that was going on in this period. And you have to give EC credit. They went after this. Now, other people did too. Edward R. Murrow, and who were major newscasters of the period, they certainly raised these issues. But EC did it on a broad approach that was really funny, humorous, at the same time was very satirical and very insightful. And they even used references to Greek mythology. There's a notorious myth in Greek mythology about two brothers who are fighting against each other, and they finally decide they have to cease this. And one brother, Danis, has 50 daughters, and the other brother, Gyptus, has 50 husbands. I think that's how it works out. And well, unknown to going to happen here is the daughters of Danis marry the sons of Gyptus, but on their wedding night, they take out knives and all but one kill their husband. So this is grim stuff. Well, I remember reading it. It was in a horror comic, and it probably was from Tales from the Crypt or something like that, where this man has a dream of his mother-in-law killing her husband on her wedding night, and he wakes up and here's his wife with an axe all posed to chop him up. It's grisly stuff, but it's classic mythology. I've mentioned here too, certainly from my perspective as a retired minister, there's no collection of literature that is more graphic and gruesome than the Bible. And this point's been made time and time again. When people want to start censoring books that are in libraries and so forth, they're concerned about their influence on young people, they don't seem to realize that whatever criteria they come up with usually fits the Bible to some greater or lesser extent. Yes, there are stories in the Bible that aren't for children, to be sure. There are plenty of ones that are for children. But the fact remains that many of these are warnings about what can happen. And a lot of what goes on in the EC comics, too, is sort of a moral kind of warning. That you read about people who are trying to get away with crimes or even murder or something like that, and they always fail. Now, there are ones where people are just victims. That has to be said. But there's a number of other ones where you have somebody going to make elaborate plans to kill his wife, and he's got it all worked out, and then it all backfires, and he gets caught. It's like an Edgar Allan Poe story. So the nature of these stories, the nature of the comics, really was quite varied and drew on classic kind of themes. There certainly was a sense in which beware that your sin will find you out, that retribution occurs. Not a whole lot of redemption, I'm afraid. So, I have to qualify this. But EC were the leaders in the horror comics and in the science fiction. I mentioned, too, that there's a science fiction episode. We talked about this, I think, earlier, set in outer space, and this envoy from Earth arrives on this planet, and he's got all the covering up of got a space uniform on, got a big helmet on him. And he comes to see this planet that wants to join an international galaxy confederation. But he finds out that there are, I think it's there are blue people and red people on this planet, and the blue people have terrorized and discriminated against the red people, and so he says to them, he says, because you've got this discrimination, you're not ready to join the Intercontinental Galaxy Federation. And the final panel of the story shows finally this astronaut gets back into his spaceship and takes off his helmet, and we see he's a black man. Now, this is like 1952, 53. This is before a landmark decision affirming civil rights, Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas, where the Supreme Court maintained that discrimination was against the law, long history. So you had there's a real social conscience going on here. Now, not all the products of EC, and they made so many of them, are worth reviewing. They're all things we can learn from, but they are sometimes grisly. And the one that was most outrageous, I have to say this though, it's just, and at this point it gets funny because it gets to be so crazy. There's this one about an infamous baseball game, and somehow a player on the team has done something that has really negatively affected the team. He's betrayed the team in some way, and as a result, the members of the team kill him. Now, not only did they kill him, they dismember him and use parts of his body for a midnight baseball game. In other words, his head is the ball, and one of his legs is the bat, and his intestines mark the baselines. it's it's so crazy. It is kind of funny, but it is grisly. And of course, again, this is the kind of thing. If you had no imagination or no appreciation for satire, I mean, that would definitely be the case with people like Estes Kefauver and certainly others who followed in his wake. That if you didn't really appreciate, then it's all lost on you. But for lots of kids in that era, they just got a real kick out of it. They weren't going to become juvenile delinquents. They weren't going to go home and murder their parents or anything like this. In spite of what Frederick Wortham said, they might have found it a little scary. I found these things scary. I saw them when I was probably 7, 8 years old, and I'd say at that point they were no longer on the newsstands, but they were around, and you could see them, and there was kind of an approach avoidance kind of thing. We talk about that with horror films or horror themes in general. We're intrigued by it. We kind of want to watch it, but at the same time, we want to hold our hand over our eyes, and we don't really want to see what's happening. And that was kind of what you had here with the EC. But they had wild stuff, and they literally, sort of the mad ones, parodied everything. I talked about my favorite horror story was The Hound of the Baskervilles. Well, they had a really crazy parody called The Hound of the Basketballs. Or they had a version of Alice in Wonderland where the White Rabbit is Bugs Bunny going, what's up, Doc? And all this kind of stuff. It was just very imaginative and in many cases really very funny. So EC, they basically tried to survive when the code went in, but the code was so severe that you almost couldn't do anything that had any kind of dark image to it at all. And one of the post-code stories they had was about maple trees taking over the world. Really? This is so somehow these maple, and the cover has this guy walking down the street, and here's all these maple branches coming out after him. Needless to say, these did not survive. They were pretty well lost. And by the late 50s, the superhero comics were coming back from DC, and the real revolution was going to occur in 1961 with the emergence of Marvel Comics, and with Stan Lee's take on everything from Fantastic Four to Spider-Man to the Hulk, and comic books go on at a whole level. And they're still very much with us. But EC is to be commended because they showed from the very beginning that you could produce things that were funny, that were maybe a little outrageous, but also had important lessons, and that they actually took on the McCarthy era conspiracy, if you want to use that term, or outrageous claims about communist infiltration and all this other kind of thing. Again, where even Lucille Ball was under investigation, and nobody was safe from this. So these things can happen again, and I think we see examples in our present day where it's going to get to be very stringent approaches to things. I'm not going to get into all that here on the podcast, but we are seeing these kind of things where there's a broad sweep being pushed across the screen of social issues, and with this sense that now people can go to jail if they're not complying. That has echoes of what happened all the way back in beginning with the Hollywood 10 in 1947 and continuing with the McCarthy era that goes well into the 1960s and still lingers to some extent. So that's enough for now. EC was entertainment comics, notorious and controversial, but creative and funny, and in many cases, socially challenging, ethically challenging. So not for everybody, but for older kids and even adults, even to this day. The EC comics are worth looking at. Many of them have been reprinted in graphic style. Certainly, all the Mad ones have been made available. The EC brand will, even though we're going back like 70 years, is still with us and is still worth pursuing. So that's for now. This is Paul, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 times the terror.
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that one again. Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.